everyone. So my name's Tash. I'm a solutions architect at AWS. I mainly look after central government customers, so some of those that are actually in the room today, which is great. So great to see you all. DVLA and DVSA, and a few other customers as well. As part of my role at AWS, we also get to specialize. So my specialism, as you can probably guess, is data and analytics. And today I'll be speaking a little bit about Zero-ETL. Just to get a view of everyone's knowledge in the room, who has heard of ETL before? Or who has built an ETL architecture before? Fantastic. Now, for those that don't know about it, I will explain what ETL actually is, so don't worry. But today is going to be a little bit about Zero-ETL. So how can we get away from manual ETL to making it more automated to make essentially data engineers' lives easier? So in terms of the agenda, so what I'm going to be speaking about today, I'll start off with what you can expect from this talk. I always like to start off with that, just so you can know what to expect, what I'm going to be talking about today. We'll then go a little bit around into the challenges of data integration and processing. So why are we talking about Zero-ETL? What are some challenges that engineers commonly see around ETL pipelines? We'll then go into, evidently, what is Zero-ETL. We'll look at a sample architecture, so you can see how that looks for real from an architectural sense. And your question may be, well, Zero-ETL is all well and good, but what if I still need ETL? What's my option then? And then also how you can set up a Zero-ETL architecture in your organization, and then I'll give you a little link to go and try it out. So what to expect from this talk? I used to be a developer before I was a solutions architect. I was a developer for about 4 years before I joined AWS. This particular session is going to be data and analytics related, but if you've ever kind of delved into data and analytics on AWS, you may have seen that a lot of those services are also serverless. So we'll also point out as we go along what services we talk about that are serverless and how you can use them to really get away from the managing of data pipelines yourself. This is going to be a mixture of presentations, interaction, and demos. So like I asked at the beginning, who knows what ETL is? I may ask you to raise your hands. And we'll also have a demo at the end so you can actually see how Zero-ETL works. And then with the interaction, I like to keep my talks interactive, so I'd love it if you could interact with me, raise your hands if you can, and ask me questions at the end too. So setting the scene with this, first of all, we've kind of got a picture in the room of who knows about ETL, which is great. But what actually is it for those that don't know? So ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. So think about, let's say, a smart sensor in your home, where it tracks the energy usage or perhaps the water usage in your home. That data, typically quite raw. So if you wanted to put that into an analytics platform further down the scenes, you're going to need to transform that data in order to make it cleansed and also normalized so an analytics platform can understand that properly. And that's what ETL is used for. It's used to essentially cleanse and normalize the data in order to get it ready for analytics. Now, if we look at the process of that behind the scenes, so who runs a database in the room today? Now, I'm going to expect anyone in IT probably has run a database at some point in their lives, right? So raise your hands if you've used a database before. Raise your hands if you've used a software as a service product before. Raise your hands if you have ever used third-party data to enrich your data as is today. A few more, nice. Media, so have you ever dealt with photos and videos? Maybe even GIFs or memes? Yeah, nice. And streaming data? Anyone have any streaming data use cases like that thermostat example I used earlier? A few more, cool. So between all of that, when we're trying to get the full picture of an organization, a data set, or even a customer, we have to have this quite complex thing in between it. And this quite complex thing involves quite a lot of different sectors, let's say. So you have to manage the data ingestion. So how is that data going to get in and then to your business and customers? You're going to have to set up different zones for that data to sit in. So landing zone, transform zone, curation zone for that data to sit in for that analytics platform. And between all of that, you have to process the data, make sure it's secure and governed, and also make sure those data pipelines are monitored effectively as well. So if we think of some of the data integration and processing challenges that we can see, where we have to do this quite manually, it can involve a number of different things. So behind that manual data pipeline is going to be a lot of code. Who has used Apache Spark or Scala before in the past? Cool, a few hands. And typically, Apache Spark or Scala is what's used behind the scenes to build these data pipelines and to run ETL jobs to do that data processing. The insights also that's coming through that data pipeline, where we're building them manually, insights can become incomplete, inconsistent and stale because they're not regularly kept up to date. Also, the management of the data pipelines is quite hard, especially if you're doing that manually. If you think of a small team, maybe 1 or 2 people, having to manage that data pipeline all by themselves, that's quite complex. Often need specialized skills in Spark or Scala, as an example. And then also, scalability issues, where we're building something manually, again, it's a slow process, and also it can become quite expensive from both a time and resources perspective. And oftentimes, where we're doing that manually, we can feel a lot like this, and I felt like this in the past too, and you may have too. So what is Zero-ETL? Has anyone heard of this term before I came to do this presentation today? Has anyone experimented with a Zero-ETL integration recently? No? Cool. Well, that's good then. We're going to learn about it. So the beginning. What happened in the beginning kind of in our drive to Zero-ETL? Because it's actually a journey that's been going on for quite a long time at AWS. So in the start, we launched services, for example, like AWS Glue, Redshift, simple storage service, services for connecting to hundreds of data sources on AWS and also outside as well. And then you've also got AWS Glue. Who uses Glue or who has used Glue on AWS before? Cool, so about a quarter of the room, which is really cool. So this is where you can do your ETL. So Glue is essentially managed ETL on AWS, essentially managed Apache Spark. And what we've done more recently, and this has come around as of about a year/2 years ago, is this Zero-ETL feature. So we've launched a number of integrations over the last 1 or 2 years to be able to essentially closely integrate services like Redshift and OpenSearch closer to things like your operational databases. So for example, you've got a database, your data's already structured, right? Don't need to do any ETL on that between the database and the analytics platform probably. So what about just having a direct integration between that database and the data warehouse? And this is what these Zero-ETL integrations are looking to achieve. But as you may have noticed, as I said earlier, this has actually been going on for quite a while. So who has used Redshift Spectrum before? Or who has queried a data lake? Who has used S3 in the room as their data lake? Yeah, if you've used AWS, you've probably used S3 at some point in your career. So essentially, native integration for data lakes, so that's Redshift Spectrum, being able to query your data lake from your data warehouse. That's been around actually for quite a while, I think 7, 8 years now. So even though we didn't explicitly call it out as Zero-ETL, what Zero-ETL's aim to do is to make data integration easy for developers and also data engineers. So over time, we've slowly been building that up into what we call Zero-ETL right now, trying to have direct integrations into the services themselves so you don't have to go out to another service to go build a thing. So these are some of the Zero-ETL integrations that have been launched most recently. So with Amazon Redshift, you've got now a direct integration between Aurora MySQL and RDS MySQL. That's in what we call generally available. That means you can use it right now in your production deployments. So go to the AWS console right now. It will be there for you to try out. You've also got a direct integration between DynamoDB and also Aurora PostgreSQL, but that's currently in preview. So that means it's currently in development with AWS. It's available for you to test out, for example, in your test or development environments, but we don't recommend using it in production because the service is currently in development. So essentially what will happen, so I'll give the example in Aurora MySQL as an example. Let's say you write data into the MySQL database. Within a matter of milliseconds, that data will then go into Redshift if you set up that integration correctly. And also, if the data is already there and you set up the integration and you say, right, I want my data now to go across into Redshift, that will end up in a database in Redshift for you to query. So the key challenge this is trying to solve is previously you had to build a glue pipeline in between that database and Redshift if you wanted the data to get in there. And that previously was very difficult, as we previously discussed. So we're just trying to make that easier for everyone, essentially. And then with OpenSearch, all of those integrations are now generally available. So same thing as I spoke about in Redshift, put data in DynamoDB, put data in your data lake in S3, and put data in DocumentDB. And if you set up the integration, that data will replicate over into OpenSearch. Now let's look at a sample architecture. So we're going to start off with a little example, and this was a customer that we worked with a number of years ago. This was a retail customer. And they essentially had 6 different data sets. These data sets were using different services on AWS, and they essentially wanted an easier way to integrate their data together. So this is the as-is architecture. At the moment, 6 different data sets, 4 going into a transactional database in Aurora. They had to build a Glue data lake and then a Glue pipeline in between that and Redshift. And then that was exposed to the business via a business intelligence dashboard, a SQL client, and also a machine learning service called SageMaker. For the real-time data, that went in through Kinesis data streams. That data got staged in an S3 data lake and then into Glue for that to be processed, to then that ending up in the analytics layer in Redshift and then exposed into the consumer platform. So let's look at how we can use the Zero-ETL integrations and also some of the earlier integrations in order to make this architecture a little bit easier for this customer. So where we're going to start off first is this first bit here. So where we've got Glue, S3 and Glue between Aurora and Redshift. Now what you can probably guess is going to happen is now that can be removed, because what I can do is now add an auto-ingestion feature using the Aurora Zero-ETL integration. So rather than having to build that data pipeline in between the two, I can have a direct integration, so I don't have any of that manual work having to create that pipeline for myself. I can then start looking at the real-time streaming part of it as well. So let's look at the S3 and AWS Glue part, which is between Kinesis and Redshift. So what I can do there is create what's called a materialized view in Redshift, which is essentially a view over a certain part of that data that's streaming through. That data is going to stream into that view and then be consumed by Redshift. So now, again, I don't need that Glue process in between that. I can skip that entirely. And then let's look at the flat files option. So if we've got kind of flat files like text, JSON, or CSV files coming into AWS, again, I do have to keep the S3 part because the data needs somewhere to land before it ends up in Redshift. But as soon as that data goes into S3, I can set off a trigger and do an auto copy straight into Redshift, so those data sets that I want in there goes immediately in there without me having to do anything. Now you may be asking, well, I don't want all of the data in my database to go to Redshift. I only want to filter some. There's PII in that database. I don't want that to go into my analytics platform to be used by my data analysts or end up in a business intelligence dashboard available to everyone. So if there is that requirement, I can filter certain data going from Aurora to Redshift, stop, for example, data that I don't want going in there. But if I still needed to query it, I can either use a federated query to those databases, so I can connect to that database via my data warehouse and do a query on that database. Or if the data is in my data lake, I can do a direct query again from my data warehouse in there to get to the data in my data lake. And then, anyone use SageMaker before in the audience or is using it right now? So a few hands up, cool. So if you are using Redshift or a data warehouse at the moment, you might not be aware that there is actually now a feature in Redshift called Redshift ML, And you can actually now create machine learning models directly in your data warehouse. So if you have data in your data warehouse that you want to train, let's say you want to do a little bit of fraud detection, probably one of the most common ones I see where people are using this. Really good feature to try out, especially if you're using SageMaker right now, because you no longer have to then go into SageMaker to use that data alongside Redshift. And then you've also got the data sharing part of Redshift. So if you have multiple data warehousing clusters that you want to share together, that's also something that could be integrated in that architecture. But your question may be, but what if I still need ETL? Or what are my options, like if I still need ETL, or even why would I need ETL in this scenario? So has anyone ever had to do any transformation on data before it's landed in the data layer? So for example, has anyone ever been involved in data quality checks before that data lands? For example, in the analytics layer? Yeah, cool. So that's an example of one. Let's say I want to remove bad quality data before that ends up in the hands of the business. That might be a use case where you might still need ETL. And also, for example, let's say the data is very raw already, you want to remove duplicate fields or null values, again, another example of ETL in there. Or if the data is very unstructured and raw in nature, never put a load of unstructured or raw data into an analytics platform. It's just not going to work well. So let's say a legacy database migrating to AWS, you're still going to need ETL. Or, for example, lots of unstructured logs or application files that need to be analysed. Again, another example of where you're still going to need it. But if you want to combine it all together, so if you wanted to use a combination of Zero-ETL and still use ETL, you can still do that. So I apologise for those at the back of the room because I realise this is quite small on the screen. But let's say the streaming side of things, you can do a direct streaming ingestion straight into the analytics layer. If you've got Amazon Aurora databases, again, you can do a direct Zero-ETL integration between that and the analytics layer. And also, for any flat files, you can still use ETL in there. It's how the services integrate with each other. So, yeah, you can still have Glue and the Zero-ETL integrations in there if you do still have a small requirement, let's say, for one or two data sources where you may still require that ETL, you can still integrate that there. Cool. So how can you set this up for yourself? And this is where I'm going to get onto a quick demo on this to show you how you can do it. So I've got an Aurora MySQL database that's empty at the moment. I'm going to load some data in there during this demo. And I'm just going to show you how that then replicates over to a data warehouse in Amazon Redshift so you can see how this works for real. So let me just pause this video. Yeah, that's already paused, so I can talk through this. Yeah, so this particular data set is a sample data set that we use quite commonly in our demos and something that I build a lot with in my POCs as well. But it's essentially a ticket sales data set. So we've got about 7 tables at the moment with essentially mocked up data around tickets that have been sold for various concert venues in the US. So 7 tables, and essentially the aim of this is we've got an Aurora MySQL database. We want to replicate that data over into the data warehouse pretty quickly. So we're going to do a Zero-ETL integration to do that. So let me skip that onto the AWS console. Cool. So to set it up, what I'm doing here is just going to the RDS console, Relational Database Service. And I realise it's a bit blurry on the middle screen, so I'll try and explain this as best I can as it goes through. And essentially, on the Amazon RDS console, you've got a little tab for Zero-ETL integrations. So I'm just going to go to create a Zero-ETL integration, give it an integration identifier name. So I'm going to call it Zero-ETL demo. I'm then going to find my Aurora database source. So I'm just going to select that there. And just be careful of the version as well, because you do have to be on a newer version of Aurora to use this integration. And you can see a little error comes up saying I need to fix some parameter values. Now, when you do this Zero-ETL integration, there are various parameters you have to set in Aurora for it to work. But AWS is very helpful and gives a fix it for me box to use. So it's going to suggest the parameters that I need to add and then add those for me. So it's going to give my parameter group a name, which I've highlighted there. And then it's going to give me various parameters, for example, bin log parameters, row image parameters, and also metadata parameters that I just need to turn on in order to make sure that integration works. But AWS is going to manage that all for me, so I don't really have to go in manually, find out what parameters I need and set those myself, because it's going to do it for me. When I'm ready, I'm going to press confirm. Now, when you apply a new parameter group to Aurora, the database reboots, so just be a little bit careful about that. Make sure you do it in a maintenance window. Don't do it on a production database in the middle of the day, please. Then select our target data warehouse. So in this case, it's going to be a Redshift serverless endpoint. And again, it's going to do the same error. Got some parameters I need to fix. But again, AWS can do that for me. So I'm going to tick the box, fix it for me. And then it's just going to come up again with the parameters it's going to fix. So the only things it does here is gives RDS permission to talk to Redshift. So it's just going to give a resource policy, essentially, for that to happen. And then it's going to enable case-sensitive identifiers to true. Essentially, in Redshift, because of the way Aurora works, I have to set case-sensitive identifiers to true in order for it to integrate properly with the database when the data starts coming over. Once I'm ready again, I can then press confirm. Redshift doesn't need to reboot in order to do this. It will apply it pretty quick, so I shouldn't see much impact to my Redshift cluster while it does that. This is just a section for tags and encryption. So again, the integration is automatically encrypted, but you can use your own KMS key as well if you wanted to use your own encryption on that. And then this is just going to come to the review screen just to summarize what you've already done. And you can see it's just going through and applying the parameter values. So you can see Redshift was in a matter of about 10-20 seconds. But RDS is just going to take a little bit longer just because I have to do a database reboot. But I can keep an eye on it and what it's doing. So where I'm going to go first is up into the Redshift one that's already done. So you can see it's applied the role all successfully. And it's enabled the case-sensitive identifiers as well. And then for RDS, it's done pretty much all the things it needs to do. The database just has to reboot in order for those new settings to apply. So I just need to wait for that to reboot. Database reboot can take anywhere from about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how big that database is and what settings it needs to apply. So again, I'm going to speed the video up. That's now applied. And then what I'll be able to do now is create that Zero-ETL integration. So I'm just going to create that there. That's going to create. And again, this is a process that's going to take about 15-20 minutes to create. So again, I'm just going to speed up the video of when that's ready to do. So about 10 to 15 minutes later, that integration is now active. But as you may have noticed, as I said earlier, that database is currently empty. So I'm going to have to put some data in there for that data to replicate across the data warehouse. Before I do that, I'm going to log into my data warehouse, connect to my serverless endpoint, and then create a database in my serverless endpoint for that data from Aurora to appear. But before I do that, I need to create a database out of the integration ID. So I'm just going to grab the integration ID that it's created for me as part of that Zero-ETL integration, paste that in a command to create the database, and essentially it will pick up when that data starts going into Aurora where it needs to copy the data to, using that integration ID. And you can see that database is now popped up, so I've called it Aurora Zero-ETL. And what I'm going to do now is connect to my Aurora database client. So I'm just going to get the database endpoint, and I'm going to connect to it. So I'm just picking up my writer endpoint so I can write some data into Aurora. And I'm going to connect to that using an EC2 instance as my client. But really, you can use any client you want to connect to Aurora. So that's just going to log into EC2 now. And I'm just going to get some fairly simple DML commands in order to start copying tables and data in there, but first I have to connect to the Aurora instance. So I'm just putting in the writer endpoint and giving it a username and password, and now I'm in the MySQL database. So these are just some DML commands I'm going to use. I'm going to create some tables for that data to go, so I'm just going to do that first, and that's going to be fairly quick, because when we're creating tables, there isn't any data in there yet. I'm just defining what the data classes are that I want, and also the table and the column names. And again, I'm just going to put the data in there now, so that's going to start copying data from S3 into that Aurora database, into those tables I've just created. And now, I'm just going to keep an eye on Redshift as that goes, and just look for what I've just created in Aurora. And you can see within a matter of about 20 seconds, those tables that I've just created have popped up. Now I'm just going to run some commands to ask Redshift how many rows of data are already in there from my copy commands. So about 5 commands have done so far out of 7 that I'm doing there. And you can see some tables have completed, so we're at 4 tables completed right now, and the other 3 are still going. So it's just loading in a few million rows into Aurora right now, which are then copying over into Redshift. And then if I wanted to keep an eye on that integration as that keeps going, I can then go to the integration, look at the integration metrics, have a look at any lag on those tables. So you can see at the moment there's a lag of about 11 seconds. So Redshift is about 11 seconds behind Aurora as those tables copy in. And you can see now, hopefully, it's replicated all of the tables. So if I refresh that, you can now see all of the tables have synced up successfully with Aurora, and all of that data is now copied in. And if I then go check with Redshift and run that command again, as you see we're still waiting for 2 other tables, I think, you can now see the data's all in there. And that Zero-ETL integration is just completed, probably in less than about 1 to 2 minutes there. So really, really useful integration, especially if you've got transactional databases that you're looking to get insights on, looking to do analytics on. Really, really useful way of doing this using a Zero-ETL integration. Now, I mentioned there was an option for you to try it out as well. This is a QR code over to the workshop, and that demo was essentially simulating what you would do in that workshop, but you'll build this for yourself. So try it out if you'd like to. Again, we'll share the slides at the end of this as well, so you can go have a look, but please have a go. Have a go with your own data as well if you want to have a go with it. And yeah, enjoy. I hope that was useful. Thank you very much for listening. And yeah, enjoy the rest of serverless days.